The fastest way to discover what people really think about you is to lose the things they respect. My name is Daniel Brooks, and the day my wife dumped a bucket of dirty water on me in front of hundreds of people was the day I finally understood who she really was. The company picnic took place every summer at a large lakeside park just outside Dallas. Employees brought their families, children ran across the grass, food trucks lined the parking area, and management handed out awards beneath white tents decorated with company banners. It was supposed to be a celebration. At least that was the idea. By noon, the Texas sun hung high above the lake, and the temperature had already climbed past 85 degrees. Laughter echoed across the park while groups of employees gathered around picnic tables. Everywhere I looked, people wore company shirts displaying the same corporate logo, a logo that most people saw as a symbol of success. To me, it represented something very different. But nobody there knew that, especially not my wife. Melissa walked several steps ahead of me as we entered the event. She looked elegant as always. Designer sunglasses, expensive jewelry, perfect hair. If someone had met us for the first time, they probably would have wondered why she married a man dressed in simple jeans and a plain button-down shirt. That question had become increasingly common over the years. Melissa's family asked it openly. Her friends asked it privately. Even some co-workers seemed confused by it. The truth was simple. I stopped caring about appearances a long time ago. Melissa never did. "Try not to embarrass me today," she said while adjusting her sunglasses. I smiled faintly. "Good afternoon to you too." She rolled her eyes. "I am serious, Daniel." I know. The strange thing was that I was not offended anymore. When someone repeats the same criticism often enough, eventually it becomes background noise. Melissa's parents were already waiting near one of the tents. Richard Hayes immediately waved her over. My father-in-law loved reminding everyone that he was a senior manager at the company. His wife Linda enjoyed mentioning it even more. Beside them stood Melissa's younger brother Kevin, who had recently been promoted and spent most conversations explaining why he deserved another promotion. All three worked for the same company. All three believed they understood exactly how the corporate world functioned. None of them understood nearly as much as they thought. "Daniel finally made it," Kevin said with a laugh when he saw me. "I was not sure you owned clothes nice enough for this event." Richard chuckled. Linda smiled politely but did not disagree. Melissa laughed too. That part bothered me more than the joke itself. For years I had watched her join their criticism instead of defending me. I greeted everyone anyway. There was no point arguing. The afternoon continued much the same way. Conversations drifted towards salaries, promotions, luxury vacations, and expensive purchases. Every topic somehow became another opportunity for someone to remind me that I did not fit their definition of success. Melissa participated enthusiastically. Around 3 o'clock, several employees organized a cleanup contest near the lake. Volunteers collected trash and debris while management awarded small prizes. Melissa joined one of the teams. I stayed nearby talking with a few employees who were far more pleasant than her relatives. Then it happened. One volunteer carried a large bucket filled with dirty water collected during the cleanup. Melissa reached for it while laughing about something Kevin had said. At the exact moment she turned around, she spotted me standing nearby. Her expression changed immediately. Irritation. Embarrassment. The same look I had seen countless times. "There he is," she said loudly enough for several people to hear. "The man who never understands when he is not wanted somewhere." A few people laughed awkwardly. Then, with a careless motion, she swung the bucket toward a disposal container. The water never reached the container. Instead, it splashed directly across my shirt, jeans, and shoes. Muddy water dripped from my sleeves. The crowd fell silent for half a second. Then Kevin laughed. Richard laughed. Several others joined in. Melissa looked at me and shook her head as though the entire situation were somehow my fault. "Seriously, Daniel," she said. "Why were you standing there?" More laughter followed. I looked down at my soaked clothes. Then I looked back at my wife. She did not apologize. Not even for a second. In fact, she seemed more concerned about her own embarrassment than mine. Around us, conversations slowly resumed. People smiled. People whispered. People moved on. I simply stood there quietly while dirty water continued dripping onto the grass. Nobody noticed the black luxury sedan pulling into the executive parking area near the main tent. Nobody noticed the man stepping out while scanning the crowd. And nobody noticed that his eyes had already found me. The man who stepped out of the sedan was Michael Grant, the company's chief executive officer. Most employees only saw him a few times each year. Whenever he appeared at an event, people noticed. Executives adjusted their posture. Managers suddenly became more attentive. Employees whispered. Yet at that moment, nobody was paying attention to him. They were too busy laughing about what had just happened to me. I reached into my pocket, pulled out a handkerchief, and calmly wiped some of the muddy water from my face. Melissa folded her arms and looked annoyed rather than apologetic. Maybe next time you will pay attention to where you are standing, she said. Kevin laughed so hard he nearly spilled his drink. Come on, Melissa. Give him a break. He probably thought this was his big corporate networking opportunity. More laughter followed. Richard shook his head. Daniel always had terrible timing. Linda smiled awkwardly, but she never corrected anyone. She never had. I simply nodded. Years ago, comments like those would have bothered me. Back then, I still believed that if I worked hard enough, acted kindly enough, and remained patient enough, eventually Melissa's family would accept me. Over time, I learned something important. Some people do not judge you based on your character. They judge you based on what they believe you can do for their social status. And according to them, I offered very little. I am going to clean up, I said quietly. Melissa shrugged. Good idea. Not a single apology. Not a single expression of concern. Nothing. I turned and began walking toward the restroom facilities near the main pavilion. As I moved through the crowd, I noticed several employees avoiding eye contact. Others looked embarrassed on my behalf. A few offered sympathetic smiles. Those reactions mattered more than the laughter. They reminded me that not everyone in the world measured people by job titles and appearances. Halfway across the lawn, I heard someone call my name. Daniel. The voice belonged to Michael Grant. I stopped. Several nearby employees immediately fell silent. The CEO rarely approached people directly. Michael extended his hand. Good afternoon. I shook it. Good afternoon, Michael. His eyes briefly moved toward the stains covering my shirt. A faint expression crossed his face. Not amusement. Disappointment. He had clearly witnessed enough to understand what happened. Do you have a moment later this evening? He asked. Of course. Good. There are several matters we should discuss. I nodded. I will be available. He gave a small smile. I know you will. Then he continued walking toward the executive tent. Behind me, whispers immediately erupted. Employees exchanged confused looks. Managers stared. A few people appeared genuinely surprised that the CEO knew my name. I continued toward the restroom without reacting. Inside, I stood before the mirror and examined the damage. Muddy streaks covered most of my shirt. Water dripped from the cuffs onto the tile floor. The sight should have embarrassed me. Instead, I found myself strangely calm. Maybe because moments like this were no longer surprising. Melissa had spent years becoming increasingly frustrated by my refusal to chase recognition. In her mind, success was something visible. Expensive cars, large houses, prestigious titles, public admiration. She never understood why I avoided those things. Then again, I had never explained. After cleaning up as much as possible, I returned to the event. The atmosphere had changed slightly. Michael's arrival shifted everyone's attention toward executive presentations and award announcements. Melissa stood beside her family near the front. Rose. She barely acknowledged my return. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the park as employees gathered beneath the largest tent. A stage had been prepared for speeches. Company leaders sat in reserved seats near the front. Richard leaned toward Melissa with obvious excitement. I have a good feeling about today, he said. Several senior positions are opening next quarter. Kevin grinned. I have been hearing the same thing. Melissa smiled proudly. You both deserve it. Richard nodded confidently. The company rewards people who matter. The words were not directed at me. They did not need to be. Everyone understood the implication. I quietly took a seat several rows behind them. As applause filled the tent and executives began approaching the stage, my phone vibrated inside my pocket. A single message appeared on the screen. It came from Michael Grant. Tomorrow, 8 o'clock sharp. Boardroom. Do not be late. I read the message once, then locked the screen. Ahead of me, Melissa laughed at something Kevin said. None of them had any idea why the CEO had contacted me. None of them knew what would happen the following morning. And none of them were prepared for the truth that had been sitting quietly in front of them for years. That evening, the drive home was unusually quiet. Melissa spent most of it scrolling through her phone while I focused on the highway stretching ahead beneath the fading Texas sunset. Orange light reflected across the windshield as downtown Dallas slowly disappeared behind us. Neither of us mentioned what happened at the company picnic. Neither of us mentioned the bucket of dirty water. Neither of us mentioned the CEO. Sometimes silence says more than an argument ever could. When we finally arrived home, Melissa stepped inside first and tossed her purse onto the kitchen counter. "I cannot believe Kevin is still waiting for another promotion," she said casually. "He does more work than half the managers there." I removed my watch and placed it beside my keys. "Maybe things take time." She laughed. "That sounds exactly like something you would say." I smiled faintly. "What is that supposed to mean?" She opened the refrigerator and grabbed a bottle of water. "It means you are always comfortable waiting, comfortable settling, comfortable being average." The words were familiar. Melissa had been saying versions of them for years. At one point they hurt. Now they simply revealed how differently we viewed the world. "Not everything valuable happens quickly," I replied. She shook her head. "That is easy to say when you are not trying to accomplish anything." Then she walked upstairs. I remained in the kitchen for a few moments, staring through the window into the dark backyard. The strange thing was that Melissa genuinely believed she understood me. She thought I lacked ambition because I drove an older truck. She thought I lacked success because I wore simple clothes. She thought I lacked influence because I never talked about it. In reality, she only knew the version of me I allowed the world to see. Around 10 o'clock, I entered my home office and closed the door. Unlike the rest of the house, this room reflected who I really was. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined one wall. Financial reports filled several cabinets. A large monitor displayed market updates from around the world. Framed photographs hung beside industry awards that almost nobody had ever seen. Melissa rarely entered the room. She called it my boring workspace. That misunderstanding had always worked in my favor. I sat down at my desk and opened a secure folder on my computer. Dozens of reports appeared instantly. Acquisition proposals, investment summaries, quarterly performance reviews, documents connected to a business empire that operated quietly beneath the surface of everyday life. Most people imagine wealth as something loud. Mansions, private jets, luxury cars. My experience had taught me the opposite. Real power often prefers privacy. My phone rang. The screen displayed Michael Grant. I answered immediately. "Good evening, Michael." "Good evening, Daniel." His voice carried the calm confidence that had made him one of the most respected executives in the industry. "I assume you received my message." I did. A brief silence followed. Then he sighed. "I was disappointed by what happened today." I knew exactly what he meant. "It is not important. Perhaps not to you." He paused. "But several board members witnessed it." I leaned back in my chair. "Let us focus on tomorrow." Michael laughed quietly. "That is exactly what your father would have said." The mention of my father brought a smile to my face. He had built the foundation for everything long before I took control. Years earlier, he taught me a lesson I never forgot. If people respect you only after discovering your status, they never respected you at all. Tomorrow would test that lesson once again. After ending the call, I opened a locked drawer in my desk. Inside sat several documents bearing the company logo, corporate ownership records, voting shares, executive authorizations, evidence of a truth almost nobody knew. Even within the company itself, only a handful of senior leaders understood the complete structure. Employees knew Michael Grant as the public face of the corporation. Investors knew him as the chief executive officer. The media knew him as the leader of a successful enterprise. Very few people knew who actually controlled it. My eyes moved toward a framed photograph sitting in the corner of the desk. It showed me and my father standing beside a construction site nearly 20 years earlier. We both looked younger, optimistic, determined. "You were right," I said quietly to the photograph. "People always reveal themselves eventually." Upstairs, I could hear Melissa moving around the bedroom. She had no idea where I was. No idea what occupied my evenings. No idea that the company her father proudly served, the company her mother admired, and the company her brother desperately hoped would elevate his career was connected to me in a way none of them could imagine. Tomorrow morning, they would walk into a boardroom expecting another ordinary day. By tomorrow afternoon, nothing about their understanding of reality would remain ordinary. The following morning began before sunrise. Dallas was still wrapped in darkness when I stepped out of the house wearing a charcoal suit and a light blue tie. The air felt cool compared to the previous afternoon, carrying the kind of quiet that only exists before the city fully wakes up. Melissa was still asleep when I left, or at least she pretended to be. Lately, our mornings had become performances built around avoiding conversation. I drove downtown while the first traces of sunlight appeared along the horizon. Glass towers reflected pale orange light as traffic gradually increased around me. By 7:30, I was standing inside the executive headquarters overlooking the city. Employees moved through the lobby carrying coffee cups and briefcases, preparing for another ordinary workday. None of them realized today would be anything but ordinary. I rode the private elevator to the top floor and entered a conference room adjacent to the main boardroom. Michael Grant was already there reviewing documents. He looked up and smiled. Right on time. You expected anything different? I asked. He laughed softly. Never. A tray of coffee sat on the table between us. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the Dallas skyline stretched for miles beneath a brightening sky. Michael handed me a folder containing the final agenda. Everything is prepared. I glanced through the documents. Several leadership appointments required approval. Strategic initiatives needed review. Financial reports would be presented. On the surface, it looked like a normal board meeting. Underneath, it was something else entirely. Have they arrived? I asked. Michael nodded. Your father-in-law checked in 20 minutes ago. I smiled faintly. That sounded exactly like Richard Hayes. He treated every opportunity to impress senior leadership like a championship event. And Kevin? Already telling people he expects a promotion. Michael shook his head. Confidence is rarely his problem. We spent the next half hour reviewing details. Then, shortly before 8 o'clock, my assistant entered carrying a tablet. Everyone is seated. Michael stood and buttoned his jacket. Ready? I looked toward the boardroom doors. Always. Meanwhile, on the other side of those doors, Richard Hayes sat proudly near the front of the room. Kevin occupied a seat beside him. Both men appeared unusually optimistic. Melissa had arrived as well, invited to attend part of the leadership presentation because of her department's recent performance metrics. She sat a few rows back reviewing notes on her phone. Several managers filled the remaining seats. Conversations revolved around promotions, restructuring plans, and future opportunities. Richard leaned toward Kevin. This could be our year. Kevin nodded enthusiastically. I can feel it. Melissa smiled. You both deserve recognition. None of them noticed the nervous energy among a few senior executives seated near the front. Those executives knew something significant was about to happen. At exactly 8 o'clock, the room fell silent. The side door opened. Michael Grant entered first. Every person immediately straightened in their seat. The CEO carried his usual calm authority as he approached the front of the room. Then the second door opened. I remained where I was for a moment before stepping forward. Nobody expected to see me. The reaction was immediate. Melissa blinked in confusion. Richard frowned. Kevin actually looked irritated. Their expressions suggested they believed I had somehow wandered into the wrong place. I continued walking calmly toward the front of the room. Richard exchanged a glance with Kevin. Melissa stared openly now, clearly trying to understand why I was entering an executive-level meeting. Michael reached the podium and adjusted the microphone. Good morning, everyone. The room answered with polite greetings. He waited until complete silence returned. Then he smiled. Before we begin today's agenda, there is someone I would like all of you to properly meet. I took a seat at the long table positioned directly beside the CEO. The movement triggered visible confusion throughout the room. Managers whispered. Melissa's eyes widened. Kevin looked completely bewildered. Richard's confident expression began fading for the first time that morning. Michael rested both hands on the podium. Many of you know Daniel Brooks as a quiet man who rarely attends corporate events. He paused. What most of you do not know is that Daniel has been involved with this company far longer than any of us. The room became perfectly still. I could almost hear people breathing. Melissa slowly lowered her phone onto the table. Richard stared at me without blinking. And for the first time since the company picnic, nobody in the room was laughing. The silence inside the boardroom felt almost physical. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The only sound came from the distant hum of the building's ventilation system. Michael allowed the moment to settle before continuing. Many years ago, he said, The company underwent a major ownership restructuring. During that process, a controlling interest was transferred into a private holding structure that remains active today. Several executives nodded. They already knew this part. Most employees did not. Richard frowned slightly. Kevin looked confused. Melissa stared directly at me now, her eyes searching my face for an explanation. Michael clicked a remote. A large presentation screen illuminated behind him. Charts appeared. Corporate structures. Ownership diagrams. Historical timelines. To most people in the room, it looked like an ordinary business presentation. Then Michael advanced to the next slide. A single name appeared at the center of the screen. Daniel Brooks. The room froze. I watched the reaction unfold in real time. First came confusion, then disbelief, then the slow realization that this was not a joke. Richard's mouth actually opened slightly. Kevin blinked several times as though his eyes had stopped working correctly. Melissa simply stared. Michael continued speaking. For more than a decade, Daniel Brooks has served as majority owner and chairman of the holding company that controls this organization. Nobody interrupted him. Nobody could. The information hit too hard. Under his leadership and guidance, the company expanded into multiple states, increased shareholder value, and completed several strategic acquisitions. Another slide appeared showing financial growth over the past 10 years. Revenue increases. Market expansion. Record performance. I remained silent. This was never about showing off. It was about transparency. The board needed to move forward with several major decisions, and my public involvement had become unavoidable. A manager near the back raised a trembling hand. Are you saying Mr. Brooks owns the company? Michael smiled politely. I am saying that Daniel Brooks is the controlling owner of the organization. A ripple moved through the room. Some people exchanged shocked glances. Others looked toward me with entirely new expressions. Respect, curiosity, amazement. It was fascinating how quickly perceptions changed once status entered the equation. My father had warned me about that. He had been right. Kevin finally found his voice. That cannot be right. Every head turned toward him. Michael remained calm. It is completely correct. Kevin looked at me. You never told anyone. I met his gaze. Nobody ever asked. Several executives struggled to hide smiles. Richard leaned back in his chair as though the air had suddenly left the room. The confident man from the previous day seemed gone. For years he had lectured me about career advancement, leadership, and professional success. Now he looked completely lost. Melissa still had not spoken. She simply stared at me. Not the way a wife looks at her husband. The way a stranger looks at someone they suddenly realize they never knew at all. Michael advanced another slide. Daniel prefers privacy. That preference has allowed him to observe the company from a unique perspective. He glanced toward me briefly before continuing. It has also allowed him to evaluate character without the influence of titles or ownership. Those words landed heavily, especially on certain people in the room. The meeting moved forward, but the atmosphere never recovered. Every discussion now carried a different energy. Every presentation felt secondary. Employees who barely acknowledged me before now listened carefully whenever I spoke. Managers took notes. Executives sought my opinion. The contrast was impossible to ignore. Around noon, the formal session ended. People slowly gathered their materials and prepared to leave. Conversations erupted immediately. Shocked whispers filled the room. Questions bounced from one person to another. Yet one group remained completely silent. Richard, Kevin, Melissa. They stood together near the exit. None of them seemed eager to leave. As I organized my documents, Richard finally approached. His posture had changed. His confidence had changed. Even his voice sounded different. Daniel, he said quietly. I looked up. Richard. He swallowed hard. Why did you never tell us? It was a reasonable question, one I had heard many times before. I considered the answer carefully. Then I smiled faintly. Because I wanted people to know me before they knew what I owned. Richard lowered his eyes. He had no response. Neither did Kevin. Across the room, Melissa remained standing motionless. For the first time in years, she was looking at me without judgment, without embarrassment, without disappointment. And somehow, that realization felt far more uncomfortable than all the years she spent doing the opposite. After the boardroom emptied, I remained seated for several minutes reviewing documents that no longer held my attention. Through the glass walls, I could see employees moving through the executive floor carrying laptops, coffee cups, and folders. Yet the energy throughout the building had changed. News travels fast inside any company. News like this travels faster. By the time I stepped into the hallway, people who had barely acknowledged me the day before were suddenly offering greetings, smiles, and handshakes. Some reactions were genuine. Others were not. Experience had taught me the difference. Michael walked beside me toward my office. "You handled that well," he said. "There was never any reason not to." He laughed softly. Most people would have enjoyed the moment more. I looked through a nearby window overlooking downtown Dallas. That is exactly why most people should not be in positions of authority. Michael smiled. "Your father used to say the same thing." We stopped outside a corner office reserved for board meetings and private consultations. The nameplate beside the door simply read Chairman. It had been there for years. Very few people ever paid attention to it. Inside, sunlight poured across dark wood furniture and floor-to-ceiling windows. The office was elegant but understated, much like my father preferred. As Michael left for another meeting, I sat down behind the desk and opened my email. Hundreds of messages waited. Investors, executives, partners, congratulations, questions, meeting requests. Most could wait. Around noon, my assistant entered carrying a tablet. "There is someone requesting a few minutes of your time." I already knew who it was. "Melissa?" She nodded. "Should I decline?" I looked out toward the skyline. Part of me wanted to postpone the conversation. Another part understood that avoiding it would accomplish nothing. "Send her in." A few moments later, Melissa entered the office. She paused immediately after crossing the doorway. The room itself seemed to surprise her. Not because it was luxurious, because it clearly belonged to someone she never expected. For several seconds, she simply looked around. Then her eyes settled on me. "I still cannot believe this is real." Her voice sounded quieter than usual, less certain. I gestured toward a chair. "Have a seat." She sat slowly. The confidence that normally defined her seemed absent. For the first time in years, she appeared genuinely unsure of herself. Neither of us spoke right away. The silence felt different from the silences at home. Those were built on distance. This one was built on realization. Finally, Melissa looked directly at me. "How long?" I knew what she meant. "A long time." "Before we got married?" "Yes." She stared at me. "And you never told me?" I folded my hands together. "You never asked." The answer frustrated her. I could see it immediately. "Daniel, that is not fair." I smiled faintly. "Is it not?" She opened her mouth to respond, then stopped. Because deep down, she understood exactly what I meant. For years she assumed she knew everything important about me. She never cared enough to look deeper. Melissa lowered her eyes toward the desk. "I feel stupid." The honesty surprised me. "Why?" She laughed softly, though there was no humor in it. "Because I spent years thinking I understood success." Her gaze drifted toward the city beyond the windows. And apparently, I did not understand anything. I remained quiet. This was not a moment that required lectures. Life had already provided one. She looked back at me. "Were you ever going to tell me?" The question lingered between us. I considered it carefully. Probably. When I felt it would not change how people treated me. Melissa looked away immediately. That answer hurt because it was true. We both knew it. For years, she judged me based on appearances, based on assumptions, based on what she believed I lacked. If she had known the truth earlier, almost everything about our relationship would have unfolded differently. And that realization seemed to weigh heavily on her. Before leaving, she stopped at the door and turned back toward me. "Daniel." "Yes." Her eyes held a mixture of regret and confusion. "I do not know what to say anymore." I nodded slowly. "Neither do I." After she left, I remained alone in the office. The city stretched endlessly beyond the glass. Somewhere below, thousands of people were building careers, chasing promotions, and trying to prove their worth to the world. Yet the lesson occupying my mind had nothing to do with business. Status can change how people see you. Wealth can change how people treat you. But neither reveals character. They reveal the character that was already there. And for the first time, I suspected Melissa was finally beginning to understand that truth. Over the next several days, the company seemed to exist in two different realities. In one reality, people continued attending meetings, answering emails, and managing projects like nothing had changed. In the other, everyone was quietly talking about the same thing. My name, the ownership structure, the boardroom announcement. The story spread through every department faster than any official memo ever could. Employees who had never spoken to me before suddenly recognized me in hallways. Managers who once walked past me without a glance now stopped to introduce themselves. Some reactions were sincere. Others felt calculated. Neither surprised me. Human nature rarely changes. Only circumstances do. The biggest changes, however, happened inside the Hayes family. Richard became unusually quiet. During meetings, he focused more on listening than speaking. Kevin stopped making predictions about his future promotions. Even Linda, who normally avoided conflict, seemed uncomfortable. Whenever I visited, Melissa changed the most. One evening, about a week after the boardroom meeting, I arrived home to find dinner already prepared. That alone felt unusual. Over the previous few years, we had gradually drifted into separate routines. Shared meals became rare. Meaningful conversations became even rarer. Yet there she was, standing in the kitchen waiting for me. "I thought we could eat together tonight," she said. I looked at the table. Candles. Proper place settings. The effort was obvious. "That sounds nice," I replied. During dinner, she asked questions. Real questions. Questions she had never shown interest in before. She wanted to know about business decisions, investments, company strategy, leadership challenges. At first, I answered politely. But after 20 minutes, I realized something that made me unexpectedly sad. Melissa was fascinated by a version of me that had existed the entire time. The only difference was that now she could see it. "Why are you looking at me like that?" she finally asked. I smiled faintly. "Because none of these questions are new." She lowered her fork. "What do you mean?" "I mean the answers have been sitting across from you for years." The words were not angry. They were honest. That made them harder to ignore. Melissa looked down at her plate. For several seconds, she said nothing. Then she whispered, "I know." The admission lingered between us. "I spent so much time focusing on what I thought success looked like," she continued. "I never stopped to understand the person I married." Outside, rain tapped softly against the windows. The house felt unusually quiet. "Melissa," I said carefully, "this is not really about the company." She nodded immediately. "I know." Her eyes glistened slightly. "That is what makes it worse." For the first time, I believed she understood. Not because of the ownership reveal. Not because of the money. Because she finally recognized the pattern. The dismissive comments. The embarrassment. The constant assumption that I lacked value because I did not advertise it. The next weekend, a family gathering took place at Richard and Linda's house. Normally, those events followed a predictable script. Career discussions. Comparisons. Subtle criticism disguised as advice. This time felt entirely different. The moment I arrived, conversation stopped. Richard greeted me warmly. Too warmly. Kevin offered to carry my coat. Linda insisted I take the most comfortable chair in the living room. The sudden transformation would have been amusing if it were not so revealing. Throughout the afternoon, everyone treated me with extraordinary respect. They listened carefully when I spoke. They laughed at jokes that were not particularly funny. They asked for my opinion on everything from business decisions to vacation destinations. Years earlier, I might have enjoyed the attention. Now it only reinforced something my father taught me long ago. Respect that appears overnight usually has nothing to do with respect. At one point, I stepped onto the back patio alone. The evening sun cast long shadows across the yard while distant traffic hummed beyond the neighborhood. A few moments later, Richard joined me. He stood beside the railing and looked out toward the trees. "I owe you an apology," he said quietly. I remained silent. He continued, "For years, I thought I understood you." He laughed softly. Turns out I did not understand anything. I studied his expression. There was no arrogance left. No superiority. Only regret. Real regret. "We all make assumptions," I said. Richard nodded slowly. Some assumptions cost more than others. As the sun disappeared below the horizon, I realized something important. The reveal had changed how people saw me, but it had also exposed something deeper. It revealed who they were when they thought I had nothing. And that truth would matter far longer than any title ever could. Several weeks passed, and the initial shock surrounding the boardroom revelation slowly settled into something more complicated. People had stopped talking about it constantly, but they had not forgotten. The company continued operating, projects moved forward, and quarterly goals remained unchanged. Yet beneath the surface, relationships had shifted permanently. Melissa noticed it more than anyone. Every time we attended a company function, employees greeted me differently. Senior executives sought my opinion before making important decisions. Department heads invited me into conversations that once happened behind closed doors. None of it was new. The only thing that had changed was visibility. One Friday evening, the company hosted a charity fundraiser at a downtown hotel. The city lights shimmered beyond the glass entrance. Melissa stopped near a large window overlooking downtown Dallas. "Can I ask you something honestly?" she said. "Of course." She folded her arms. "When I poured that water on you at the company picnic." Her voice trailed off. Even now, weeks later, the memory clearly bothered her. "Why did you not get angry?" I thought about the question carefully. The answer mattered. Because anger would not have changed anything. Melissa stared out at the city. "I was embarrassed by you." Hearing her say it aloud felt strangely different from knowing it. More painful, more real. "I know," I said quietly. Tears appeared in her eyes almost immediately. "I keep replaying that moment in my head." She shook her head. "Not because of who you turned out to be. Because of who I was." The distinction mattered. I could hear it in her voice. For the first time, her regret was not connected to the company, the ownership, or the status. It was connected to character. Her own character. We stood in silence for several moments. Finally, she looked at me. I spent years wanting everyone to respect me. A tear slipped down her cheek. And somewhere along the way, I stopped respecting the person who cared about me the most. The honesty caught me off guard. Outside, traffic moved steadily through downtown streets. Above us, the hotel lights reflected against the glass. "Melissa," I said gently, "regret only has value if it changes you." She nodded slowly. "I think it already has." As we walked toward the garage, I found myself thinking about my father again. He used to say that life reveals people twice. First when they believe you have nothing, then when they discover you have everything. Most people only pay attention to the second reveal, but the first one is always the truth. And for the first time since that summer picnic, I sensed that Melissa finally understood the difference. 6 months later, the memory of that summer picnic felt strangely distant. Life had a way of doing that. Moments that once seemed overwhelming eventually became chapters instead of entire books. The company continued growing. New projects launched. Expansion. Plans moved forward. Employees focused on their work rather than old stories. Yet one lesson from that day never disappeared. People reveal themselves when they think there is nothing to gain. One Saturday afternoon, the company hosted another community event at the same lakeside park where everything had started. Families gathered beneath white tents. Children played near the water. Employees shared food and laughter beneath the warm Texas sun. Walking through the park felt almost surreal. The same trees stood beside the shoreline. The same walking paths curved around the lake. Even some of the same picnic tables remained exactly where they had been months earlier. Melissa walked beside me quietly. Our relationship was not magically repaired. Real change never happens that way. Trust is built slowly. Respect is rebuilt even slower. But for the first time in years, both of us were moving in the same direction. Near the center of the park, employees gathered for a recognition ceremony. Michael Grant stepped onto a small stage and thanked everyone for their contributions throughout the year. Applause echoed across the crowd. Awards were distributed. Achievements celebrated. Then Michael unexpectedly invited me to say a few words. Hundreds of people turned toward the stage as I approached the microphone. The lake shimmered behind them beneath the afternoon sunlight. For a moment, I simply looked at the crowd. Many faces were familiar. Some remembered the previous summer. Some did not. But all of them represented something larger than a company. They represented people trying to build better lives for themselves and their families. "A year ago," I began, "I stood in this same park and learned an important lesson." The crowd listened quietly. Actually, it was not a new lesson. It was one my father taught me long ago. A gentle breeze moved through the trees. He used to say that character is what remains when appearances disappear. Several employees nodded. Others listened carefully. Titles matter. Careers matter. Success matters. But none of those things tell you who a person really is. I paused briefly. How someone treats people when there is nothing to gain tells you who they are. Silence settled across the park. Not uncomfortable silence. Thoughtful silence. The kind that happens when people recognize a truth. My eyes drifted toward Melissa standing near the front. She held my gaze for a moment before looking down. Then I smiled. The good news is that people can grow. People can learn. People can become better than they were yesterday. Applause began slowly before spreading across the crowd. After the ceremony ended, employees returned to their families and activities. Conversations filled the park once again. Laughter drifted through the warm afternoon air. I stepped away from the stage and walked toward the lake. A few moments later, Melissa joined me. We stood beside the water watching sunlight reflect across the surface. "Your father sounded like a wise man," she said quietly. I smiled. "He was." She nodded. "I wish I could have met him." The statement surprised me, not because of what she said, because of how sincerely she said it. We stood there for several moments. Then Melissa took a deep breath. "You know," she said softly, "when I think about that day now, I barely remember the company." I looked at her. "No." She shook her head. "What I remember is how I treated someone who deserved better." There was no defensiveness in her voice. No excuses. Just honesty. That honesty meant more than any apology ever could. Across the lake, children laughed while skipping stones across the water. The afternoon sun slowly drifted lower in the sky. Another season was ending. Another chapter was closing. I thought about my father. About everything he built. About everything he taught me. Most people assumed the greatest thing he left behind was a successful company. They were wrong. The greatest thing he left behind was perspective. The understanding that wealth can open doors, but character determines what happens after you walk through them. As the sun settled toward the horizon, I realized something that felt unexpectedly peaceful. The story was never about ownership. It was never about status. It was never even about being underestimated. It was about discovering who people are when they think nobody is watching. And in the end, that lesson turned out to be worth far more than anything money could ever buy.